by a certain few years hence. It required an overwhelming vote, and it was ignored the day afterwards by any subsequent spending proposal that passed by a majority vote. Now, that's what's been going on for 60 years. That's certainly been going on for 33 of the last 34 years, during which time we've never balanced the budget, and we are incurring more and more increasing deficits. True, for a little dip because of the tax program of the president this last year. We will have the budget go down just a little bit up to 96, and then all of a sudden it shoots straight up in the air again. What are we going to do? Tax the American people even more? Spend even more? Nobody seems to want to do what it takes to really get this economy under control. Well, Mr. President, we could do something about it here this evening. We could vote for this balanced budget amendment, take 67 votes on the floor this evening. If we vote for it, we'll be on our way to fiscal sanity. We'll be on our way to solving these problems. Or we can ignore it, and we can continue just the way we are, with the promises that we're going to get our things under control here because we should have the fiscal discipline to do it. I thank the chair.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Illinois.
First, I want to thank Senator Dole for yielding the time. We heard my friend Senator Robert Byrd say that we're injecting fiscal policy into the Constitution. Fiscal policy is in the Constitution a great many times already. We are adding a protection, and that's what the Constitution is. It is a protection for the people against governmental abuse. And anyone who's looked at the last 25 years who doesn't believe there's governmental abuse, you're living in a dream world. Listen to Professor Larry Tribe, and he is opposed to the amendment. I don't want to mislead anyone. He was the lead witness against the balanced budget amendment 2 years ago. Listen to what he said in his testimony before the Senate committee. Despite the misgivings I expressed on this score a decade ago, I no longer think that a balanced budget amendment is, at a conceptual level, an ill-suited kind of provision to include in the Constitution. The Jeffersonian notion that today's populace should not be able, by profligate borrowing, to burden future generations with excessive debt does seem to be the kind of fundamental value that is worthy of enshrinement in the Constitution. In a sense, it represents a structural protection for the rights of our children and our grandchildren. Second, the senator from Maryland said, we really don't have that much debt. There is no problem on monetizing the debt. The reality is, when he quotes the statistics, he ignores something very fundamental. The gross debt in 1945 was about 130% relative to GDP. But there was virtually no corporate and consumer debt. When you add consumer debt and corporate debt to government debt today, we have roughly 200%. And you just take the OMB figures. We're headed toward a policy and a situation where every other nation in history has monetized the debt. We heard a great deal of history from our colleague Senator Byrd. We did not hear one bit of history, and that is that every other nation that has gone down this road has started printing money, has had hyperinflation, has monetized the debt. And then finally, Senator Byrd indicated that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and James Madison would be voting against this amendment. I can't speak for them real candidly, but when I read what Thomas Jefferson has to say about debt, I have a pretty clear idea. When I look at Washington's farewell address, he spends a good portion of his farewell address telling the nation to avoid the accumulation of debt. I think it's very clear what our founding fathers wanted. Again, every generation of Americans has taken care of themselves and invested in the future up until this generation. We're partially taking care of ourselves and borrowing from the future. That has to change, Mr. President, and we have the opportunity tonight to change it, and I hope we do the right thing for our country and for the future.
George, will you give me 30 seconds?
Yes, I'll yield to the senator.
Under the previous order, the next 20 minutes are allocated to the majority leader.
President, I yield 2 minutes to the Senator from Maryland from my leader time.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I want to make 2 points. First, I want to underscore the fact, although the Senator stated it at the outset, but he then quoted Larry Tribe. The fact is that in the course of that quote, Tribe was against the balanced budget amendment.
I said that.
All right. And secondly, with respect to Jefferson, when Jefferson said his address to Congress regarding the Louisiana Purchase, this is what Jefferson said. Should the acquisition of Louisiana be constitutionally confirmed and carried into effect, a sum of nearly $13 million will then be added to our public debt. Now, you've cited Jefferson time and time and time again. The fact of the matter is that when Jefferson had the opportunity to make the Louisiana Purchase, which was an enormous step for our nation, made us a continental nation, Jefferson was prepared in order to do it, to incur public debt, as this quote, which I've just read from Jefferson's message to the Congress, clearly states. I thank the Majority Leader.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the full text of my remarks be placed in the record as if
Without objection, that would be the order.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, for many years, and with greater urgency since 1982, when the federal deficit first exceeded $200 billion, all Americans have known that we must act to bring the deficit down. Consistently large budget deficits damage our economy. They sap economic growth by diverting resources from productive investments. They add to the debt and to the interest we must pay on the debt each year. That diverts resources from longer-range investment in infrastructure and education to crucial investments in economic growth where government plays a leading role. Yet, while virtually all agree on the diagnosis, reaching agreement on a cure hasn't been easy. Every senator knows what has to be done to reduce the deficit. There's no mystery about it. We must control the cost of health care. We have to slow down the rate of increase in the fastest-growing federal programs, Medicare and Medicaid. Left unchecked at today's rate of growth, by the turn of the century, these two programs alone will cost almost as much as everything else in the budget except Social Security. Medicare and Medicaid would almost equal the cost of every other program, from national defense to national parks. Last year, Congress enacted a program to cut the deficit by $500 billion over 5 years, a fiscally responsible budget plan which is already producing tangible results. For the first time in a half-century, there have been 3 consecutive years of deficit reduction. Interest rates have remained low, channeling billions of additional dollars into the pockets of consumers for housing and other long-term purchases. Job creation is up, and economic growth in the last quarter was encouraging. But the deficit reduction plan we approved last year, the plan that financial analysts agree has helped produce an economic rebound, that plan passed by the margin of a single vote in the Senate. Most of the senators who favor the balanced budget amendment voted against actually reducing the deficit. That vote on the budget was a time for action, not just words. This vote on the balanced budget amendment is a time for words, not action. By comparing those two votes, Americans can identify those senators who are willing to do something about the deficit and those who won't do anything but talk about the deficit. The appeal of a balanced budget amendment is obvious. Everybody wants to see the budget in balance. Amending the Constitution to proclaim that result is a simple and dramatic step. That's the appeal. But this amendment is wrong. Judge Bork testified that it would be either a vain hope or a dismal prospect. He described it well. This amendment will not succeed in balancing the budget. It does not mandate a balanced budget, nor will it produce one. By its own terms, it requires 3/5 of each House of Congress to vote for an unbalanced budget. For more than 200 years in this country, we have had 3 separate co-equal branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The elected branches are the ones accountable to the people. The unelected branch, the judiciary, is accountable only to the law. The most fundamental law in our system is the Constitution, the basic governing document of America, which some senators are now proposing to amend. It is through the courts that the rights guaranteed and the duties imposed under the Constitution are enforced. The Constitution isn't only about rights. It's about obligations. It requires the President to do certain things. It prohibits the states from doing other things. It compels the Congress to do many things. But rights or obligations that can't be enforced by the courts are merely words on paper, like the Constitution they used to have in the Soviet Union. Supporters of this amendment have said over and over again, this is not political window dressing. This will have a real effect. This will force us to adopt a balanced budget. That's been the rhetoric of the supporters of this amendment. The amendment, as originally presented to the Senate, tried to do that. The original Simon Amendment would have directly involved federal judges on a daily basis in making decisions about spending and taxes, all of the national priorities reflected in a national budget, to enforce the balanced budget. But the one thing the supporters of this amendment don't want is to see it actually enforced. And so the sponsors of this amendment insisted, as a condition of allowing the Senate to vote on their own proposal, that they be allowed to change it to prevent the courts from enforcing it. Let me repeat that. I proposed to the sponsors a vote on their amendment up or down, and they said, oh no, we don't want to vote on our amendment, and we won't permit a vote on our amendment unless you enable us to change it to prevent the courts from enforcing it. And although this change is being described as something that will prevent unelected federal judges from raising taxes, that's not what it says. It says that no court shall have the right to order any remedy to balance the budget except remedies that the Congress writes. Now, this argument is made by the same people who say that you can't rely on Congress to enforce budget discipline, so we need to amend the Constitution. But in their amendment to the Constitution, they insist that the courts be prevented from enforcing it and that enforcement be left exclusively to the Congress. This is such ridiculous circular reasoning that it must be repeated. The sponsors of this amendment say that the Congress can't be trusted to balance the budget, so we have to put the requirement into the Constitution by amendment. But then they insist that the courts be prohibited from enforcing the amendment and that enforcement be left exclusively to the Congress, whose lack of discipline, of course, is what they say motivated them in the first place. This amendment, as stated in Section 1, would not require a balanced budget. It would require 3/5 of the whole membership of each House of Congress to vote to approve an out-of-balance budget. So this amendment would give to the minority in each House a power that would shock and offend the men who wrote the Constitution. Every one of my colleagues has been in the Senate long enough to know what the Senate's filibuster rules mean. Everybody understands the tremendous leverage and power the Senate rules give to a minority in the Senate. Why any senator of either party who has been through the filibuster process would want to enshrine that in the Constitution and give such power to a minority in perpetuity is beyond my understanding. Mr. President, even the Senate, with its veneration for rules, does set aside the filibuster for certain important legislation, including the budget itself. This amendment, by contrast, writes it into the Constitution, thereby making it absolutely impossible to suspend it for even the most important legislation. Everybody here knows that budget reconciliation is the real work of cutting spending. It's where the rhetorical budget cutters are separated from the senators willing to make difficult decisions. And the Senate has specifically protected the reconciliation process against obstruction by a minority. No one can filibuster a reconciliation bill. That is so because no one, Republican or Democrat, wants to give a minority effective control of the government. This amendment turns that on its head. By giving a minority absolute power over the majority, it overrides democracy and lets a minority, in effect, control the government. Perhaps the most misleading argument made for this proposal is the one most often made. The federal government should have to do what any business does, what our state does, or what average families do, which is to balance their budget. But this amendment goes far beyond what any business, any state, or any family must do. It would require the federal government to adhere to a standard that no business, no state, no family must meet. Every state, as every senator knows, has an operating budget and a capital budget. That's how the states balance their books. They don't balance their budgets, they balance their books. They don't balance the total receipts and total spending each year, which is what this amendment says the federal government would have to do. State debt nationwide grew by $26 billion in just 1 year from 1991 to 1992, an 8% rate of increase in state debt. State debt is going up because states are not balancing their total budgets. They balance their operating budgets, and every senator, including those who wrote this amendment, knows that very well. If we required the states to adhere to the accounting that's incorporated in this amendment, most states would not be able to balance their budgets. No family's budget would be balanced. No business could operate. We don't use accounting rules that force businesses to pay cash up front for major equipment purchases or for expansion. We don't demand that an American family buy its home with a single cash payment. How many American families who aren't members of the Senate could afford to do that? What would happen to the American economy if we put into the Constitution a requirement that a family couldn't get a mortgage loan on a house, that you had to make the purchase up front in cash? Would that make sense for American families? Would that make sense for our economy? That's exactly what this will do with respect to the federal government. If we force this standard on the states, they wouldn't be able to borrow to build schools or roads or anything else. Mr. President, in a written report on this amendment, written by the sponsors of this amendment, the majority which voted to report it to the Senate floor made the following statement. Congress does not need a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Congress can achieve that goal statutorily right now without waiting to ratify a constitutional amendment. Technically, these arguments are, of course, correct. That's the sponsors of the amendment first citing critics and then agreeing that the critics are correct. That's a direct quotation written by the sponsors of the amendment, found in the second paragraph of page 5 of their report. It says, in writing, Congress can achieve a balanced budget right now without waiting to ratify a constitutional amendment. And yet, what are the supporters of this amendment doing? Are they proposing to balance the budget right now? Are they asking that we do what they say we can do right now? No, they're not. Instead, they're proposing that some other senators, in some future year, in fact, in the next century, do what they could do this very day if they were so inclined. The senators who are going to vote for this amendment to balance the budget in the next century could vote in this century, could vote right now, tonight, for the tax increases and spending cuts needed to balance the budget. But of course, they won't do that because that would be difficult and unpopular. To balance the budget now would require deep cuts in Social Security. That would be difficult and unpopular. The sponsors of this amendment won't vote for that. To balance the budget now would require deep cuts in Medicare. That would be difficult and unpopular. The sponsors of the amendment won't vote for that. To balance the budget now would require deep cuts in defense. That would be difficult and unpopular, so the sponsors of this amendment won't vote for that. And if they won't cut Social Security, if they won't cut Medicare, if they won't cut defense, then to balance the budget now would require huge tax increases. Well, we know that the sponsors of the amendment won't vote for that. The Congressional Budget Office says to balance the budget in 5 years, by 1999, would take $600 billion. We barely got half the Senate to vote for deficit reduction of $500 billion last year. In fact, what is surely one of the most telling realities of this debate is that of the 55 senators who are sponsors of this amendment, 40 of them voted against the deficit reduction bill last year. 40 out of 55. And let me repeat that. Last summer, we voted on the largest, most meaningful deficit reduction package in this nation's history. That was a time for action, not words. And 40 of the 55 senators who are now sponsors of this amendment, who are now saying that the deficit is a problem so big that we must amend the Constitution to deal with it, they voted against reducing the deficit last year. That's the difference between words and deeds. And having voted against one round of real budget cuts last year, you can be sure they aren't going to vote for a second round of budget cuts. That wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be popular. And what the sponsors of this amendment are looking for is something that's easy and something that's popular. Not one of them, not one single senator who will vote for this amendment has publicly specified what he or she would do to balance the budget. Not one. That would be the honest thing to do, but it would also be very difficult and very unpopular. And this amendment is intended to avoid difficulty and unpopularity. This amendment is intended to create the illusion of concern about the deficit while avoiding any meaningful action on the deficit. Mr. President and members of the Senate, when it comes to changing the fundamental document of our nation, the document on which our democratic system of government rests, the document that preserves the liberties of Americans by guaranteeing to each citizen equality of justice before law, this amendment takes political cynicism just too far. Amending the Constitution ought to be a very serious matter. It shouldn't be used for political cover. It shouldn't be business as usual. This is not just another bill. This is the Constitution we're talking about. When we take our oath of office, and every member of the Senate has walked up there onto that dais and raised his or her hand to swear the oath of office. And when we did, we didn't swear to uphold a particular bill or a particular budget or a particular economic policy. We swore an oath to uphold the American Constitution. Mr. President, I understand the need some feel for political cover. I understand the fear some have of taking an action contrary to the prevailing public opinion. But members of the Senate, we were elected to exercise our best judgment and to act in accordance with our conscience. And we swore to uphold the Constitution. The Constitution is more important than any one of us. Indeed, the Constitution is more important than all of us put together. I hope very much that my colleagues will not succumb to the powerful temptation to take the easy, popular way out. I know it's a powerful temptation. I believe that public support is based on misunderstanding, but I know it's there. It would be an abdication of our responsibility to succumb to that temptation to cast the easy vote for this proposal. It's not a serious proposal. It's a gimmick. It's a transparent gimmick. I urge my colleagues to reject it.
The time for debate has expired.
Mr. President, I ask for the ayes and nays.
Clerk, is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. Clerk will read the joint resolution for the third time.
Calendar number 245, Senate Joint Resolution 41, proposing an amendment to the Constitution of the United States to require a balanced budget.
Question is on the passage of the joint resolution. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Bacchus, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Biden, brown shirts, Gary. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bond. Mr. Boren. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Bradley. Mr. Bro. Mr. Brown. Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bumpers. Mr. Burns. Mr. Byrd. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Chafee. Mr. Coates. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coverdell. Mr. Craig. Mr. D'Amato. Mr. Danforth. Mr. Daschle. Mr. DeConcini. Mr. Dodd. Mr. Dole. Mr. Domenici, Mr. Dorgan, Mr. Durenberger, Mr. Exon, Mr. Faircloth, Mr. Feingold, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Ford, Mr. Glenn, Mr. Gorton, Mr. Graham of Florida, Mr. Graham of Texas, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Gregg,
This is up and down, right?
Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Hatfield, Mr. Heflin, Mr. Helms, Mr. Hollings, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inoue, Mr. Jeffords, Mr. Johnston, Mrs. Cassabaum, Mr. Kempthorne,
You got me, right?
Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Carey of Nebraska, Mr. Carey of Massachusetts, Mr. Cole, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lott, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Mack, Mr. Matthews, Mr. McCain, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Metzenbaum, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Mosley Braun, Mr. Moynihan, Mr. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nichols, Mr. Nunn, Mr. Packwood, Mr. Pell, Mr. Pressler, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed, Mr. Regal, Mr. Robb, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Roth, Mr. Sarbanes, Mr. Sasser, Mr. Shelby, Mr. Simon, Mr. Simpson, Mr. Smith, Mr. Spector, Mr. Stevens, Mr. Thurmond, Mr. Wallop, Mr. Warner, Mr. Wellstone, Mr. Wofford, Senators voting in the affirmative: Bennett, Bingaman, Bond, Breaux, Brown, Burns, Campbell, Chafee, Coates, Cohen, Craig, Danforth, Daschle, DeConcini, Domenici, Dorgan, Faircloth, Feinstein, Ford, Gorton, Grassley, Gregg, Hatch, Helms, Hollings, Jeffords, Kempthorne, Cole, Lott, Lugar, Mack, McCain, McConnell, Mosley Braun, Pressler, Roth, Sasser, Shelby, Simon, Specter, Thurmond, Wallop, and Wofford. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Nunn, aye. Ms. Mikulski. No. Mr. Metzenbaum. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Baucus, Biden, Boxer, Bradley, Bumpers, Byrd, Conrad, Dodd, Feingold, Hatfield, Inouye, Johnston, Kassebaum, Kerry of Nebraska, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Matthews, Metzenbaum, Mikulski, Mitchell, Murray, Pell, Pryor, Reed, Regal, Rockefeller, Sarbanes, Stevens, and Wellstone. Mr. Boren. Mr. Boren, aye. Yeah. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mr. Murkowski. Mr. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Dole. Mr. Dole, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Graham of Texas. Mr. Graham of Texas, aye. Mr. Heflin. Mr. Heflin, aye. Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bryan, aye. Mr. Moynihan. Mr. Moynihan, no. Mr. Derenberger. Mr. Derenberger, aye. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Coverdell. Mr. Coverdell, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. D'Amato. Mr. D'Amato, aye. Mr. Carey of Massachusetts. Mr. Carey of Massachusetts, no. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Exon. Mr. Exon, aye. Mr. Packwood. Mr. Packwood, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Graham of Florida, aye. Mr. Robb. Mr. Robb, aye. Mr. Nichols. Mr. Nichols, aye. Mr. Glenn. Mr. Glenn, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 63, the nays are 37. Two-thirds of the senators voting not having voted in the affirmative. The joint resolution is not passed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader?
I move to reconsider the vote by which the amendment was not agreed to.
Without objection, the motion to table is agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I would...
Senate will come to order.
Mr. President, I would simply...
Senator from Illinois.
I would like to thank my colleagues, my co-sponsors, all of them, but particularly Senator Hatch, Senator Craig, Senator Thurmond, Senator DeConcini, Senator Bryan. I would also like to thank the organizations that put in a tremendous effort here, and also the staff members. For my own staff, Aaron Rappaport was just superb. Jeremy Karpatkin, Susan Kaplan, David Carl, Brad Douglas, Peter Hattinger, Serena Case, Bob Dove from Senator Dole's staff, Damon Tobias from Senator Craig's staff, Thad Strom from Senator Thurman's staff, Janice Long from Senator DeConcini's staff, and Sharon Prost, Mark Disler, Sean Bentley, and Larry Block from Senator Hatch's staff. People have really been terrific, and let me also pay my respects to Senator Byrd and Senator Mitchell for fighting strenuously, to Senator Harry Reid also for the battle that he put up. It has been a fight well worth doing, and I have no regrets.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, could I have order?
Senate will come to order. Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I also want to pay tribute to those who have fought so hard for this amendment and those who fought so hard against it. It was a classic constitutional battle. They're good.
Senate will come to order. Senator from Utah.
It was a classic constitutional battle, fought hard on both sides, with, I think, good arguments made on both sides, and an awful lot of intensity on both sides. But I particularly want to thank my colleague, Senator Simon, for his leadership on this matter. And, of course, if you go right down the line, you certainly want to make special mention of Senator Simon, Senator Thurman, Senator DeConcini, Senator Craig, Senator Heflin, and others who have spent so much time on this floor trying to do everything they could. I particularly want to thank my colleague from Idaho for the many, many efforts that he's made, sincere efforts to try and bring about this balanced budget amendment. This is an important day. We lost, but it's just one loss in a long step of getting a balanced budget amendment that will work for this country, because we're convinced that nothing short of that is going to get the fiscal discipline we have to have. But in any event, I want to compliment those who have won here tonight. They fought a very strong and good battle, very formidable forces. We were almost doomed from the beginning because of the tremendous power and capacities that they have. And I certainly want to express the highest accolades for my dear friend and colleague from Illinois. I know this is a disappointment to him. On the other hand, he's fought a great fight. He's done the best he could. He's rallied forces all over the country, and we all have respect for him in this particular issue, whether we're on one side or the other. And again, my young colleague from Idaho as well. I yield to.
I thank my
from Idaho.
Mr. President. I thank my colleague from Utah for yielding. Let me thank Senator Hatch, the ranking Republican in the Judiciary Committee, for the long fight he has waged, the Senator Strom Thurmond to my immediate left, who started this battle some 30 years ago in the United States Senate with a very futuristic look toward where we must go. It is interesting that this is another one of those votes, and yet he remains as firmly committed to this issue as he always has. And of course, Senator Paul Simon, who bore a great deal of the leadership here and moved this issue forward. I concur with Senator Hatch. This is but a scrimmage in a very important battle. And this issue will be back. We'll bring it back to the floor. It'll be voted on in the other body within a few weeks. It is something that will not go away until the Congress of the United States deals with it in a responsible and equitable fashion. And yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Mr. President, first I want to commend the chief author of this legislation, Senator Simon of Illinois. He worked hard. He did a fine job. He did as well as anyone could under the circumstances. I want to congratulate, staying with Senator from Utah, Senator Hatch. He worked hard and did a fine job and did as well as anyone could have done under the circumstances. Along with him was Senator Craig of Idaho, who worked hard as any man in this Senate. He worked with the House on this matter and various others. We fought the best we could. I first started working on this question with Senator Harry Byrd Sr. and Senator Carl Munn of South Dakota about 35 years ago. We passed it through this body in 1982, sent it to the House. The leaders moved got up and moved to kill it. We just missed one vote in 86. But we're not through. We're not going to stop. We're going to continue till we get it passed. Now, why do I say that? Simply because there's no other way. We're running over $200 billion a year deficit. What can you do? What can you do except pass the Constitutional Amendment? You've got to mandate to this Congress to stop spending more than we take in. You've got to require this Congress to stop spending more than we take in. You've got to stop this Congress from spending more than we take in. The only way you can do it is to pass a constitutional amendment. So we have a day ahead yet to fight, and we will do it.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I voted against the Simon Amendment, and I feel that I must at this time explain my vote and say why I voted the way I did. I listened with some bemusement at the statement made by the distinguished senator from South Carolina he just made.
Mr. President, would the distinguished senator from Iowa yield to me for a unanimous consent agreement?
Without losing my right to the floor.
Without him losing his right to the floor. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent now that the Senate proceed as if in morning business, with senators allowed to speak therein for up to 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, reserve me the right to object. I have at least 10 minutes in which I wish to
Without,
speak.
that the senator from Iowa be allowed 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. I listened with bemusement to the statement made by the senator from South Carolina when he said that the only way we're going to force this is to mandate the Congress with a constitutional amendment. But just as the majority leader pointed out, they added a clause in there that took the Supreme Court out and said the Supreme Court couldn't review it, so who's going to mandate it? I mean, the whole thing, I think, devolved into almost the ridiculous towards the end, and that's why I voted against it. Now, I must at the outset, Mr. President, say that I do philosophically support a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. And I think I must tell you why, because there are forces that pull me in that direction. My own personal belief in frugality. That's the way I was raised. Except for 2 houses that my wife and I have purchased and a car I bought once when I was a younger man, I've never gone into debt. Because I don't believe in it. My wife and I have always saved and then bought things or invested. I think that's probably due to the influence of my father. My father worked in the coal mines most of his life. When he saved up enough money, he bought a small farm. His timing was bad. It was about 1928. The Depression came and he lost it. He impressed upon me during my early years a great fear of debt and what debt meant to him and how it destroyed his dreams. In 1981, after the Reagan tax cut was passed, I voted against it. Speaker O'Neill asked me to appear on a television program, the McNeil-Lehrer program, to talk about it. I remember at that time I held up my credit card on the McNeil-Lehrer show and I said, President Reagan and the Congress in passing this just put the country on your credit card. And it's going to feel mighty good when you're out there spending the money and borrowing it. But sometime the bill's going to come due. And what I'm afraid of is that when that bill comes due, the people that are going to have to pay it will be the working people of this country. They're the ones that will have to pay it. Well, by 1986, after phony Graham-Rudman's 1 and Graham-Rudman's 2, we kept getting deeper into debt. I didn't see any way out. And so in 1986, I supported the amendment to balance the budget in 1986. That was then called the Hatch-Simon Amendment. So I was pulled in the direction of supporting that because of my upbringing, because of my background, and because what I had seen President Reagan do to this country in pushing us deeper into debt and putting us on a credit card. But I must also say the issue of constitutional integrity also concerns me. Our distinguished President Pro Tem has spoken on that very eloquently, and I have listened as often as I could, and I have read just about all that he has spoken on this issue. Thomas Jefferson's often been quoted in this debate. Well, I'll proffer another quote from Thomas Jefferson when he said,
A permanent Constitution must be the work of quiet, leisure, much inquiry, and great deliberation. And further, Thomas Jefferson defined the Constitution, quote, as an act above the powers of the ordinary legislation. So we must, Mr. President, justify clearly and beyond doubt why it's necessary to, quote, act above the powers of ordinary legislation. Well, because of our huge debt, because of the deficit, because of our inability to come to grips with it and to make the hard choices, what it will mean in cost to future generations, the specter of monetizing the debt in the future, I believe gives us some justification to, quote, act above normal legislation. The question then becomes, what type of an amendment? How is it worded? What's in? What's out? Well, today we had two before us. Neither was perfect. I believe the Reid Amendment was better, and that's why I supported it. And there were three reasons why I did. I believe the Reid Amendment was superior to the Simon Amendment, first because it exempted Social Security. The Simon Amendment did not. Again, I would quote Robert Ball, who in the February 22nd Congressional Record, when he said that the Social Security system is self-financed and responsibly financed. Social Security has always paid its own way. From 1937 to 1992, Social Security collected $3.900.7 trillion. It paid out $3.569.2 trillion, leaving $331.5 billion in assets. Social Security has always paid its own way. But no matter. The Concord Coalition and others want to destroy this. They want to make Social Security a welfare and a means-tested program. And I believe that my prediction that I made in 1981 when I said the country was going on a credit card, and when the bill came due, we would put that bill on the backs of workers, would come true if we passed the Simon Amendment. Because in 2001, when we'd have to balance the budget, where's all the money going to be? It's going to be in the Social Security Trust Fund. And that's what we'll go after. We'll go after the payments that workers put into the Social Security Trust Fund, and we'll go after the benefits that retirees receive to balance the budget. And I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's right. And that's why I voted against the Simon Amendment. Because the Simon Amendment would have required of our workers and the elderly to pay for the profligate spending of the 1980s. Now again, according to Robert Ball, in the February 5th Post op-ed, he said that Social Security revenues will exceed outlays for the next 30 years. Even Mr. Simon agreed with that. But then he said then it starts to go down. But that's 30 years from now. Who can say what our situation will be like? By then we might find a cure for cancer. I hope we do. We might find a cure for Alzheimer's disease. We'll have health care reform, I hope, and all of these could save us untold billions of dollars, which would help our economic situation. But if the Simon Amendment were to pass, by 2001, we would start raiding the Social Security Trust Fund. You could count on it. The second reason I thought the Reid Amendment was better than the Simon Amendment was because it provided for a capital and an operating budget. Most states have these. I think we need to delineate what's capital and what's operating. It would be an apt subject for debate. I happen to believe very strongly that education is one of the most fundamental capital investments that we can make. Not an operating, but a capital investment. Now, the third reason that I believe the Reid Amendment was better than the Simon Amendment was because of the recession provision. We are a diverse nation, Mr. President. A recession may hit one area, but not another, where the votes are. In the 1980s, we had a big depression in the Midwest, but the coasts were booming. We enacted legislation to help our people out, to help our farmers out, and we passed it. But I'm not so certain that we could do that with a 3/5 majority in the Senate sometime in the future. Senator Simon says if there's a recession, you'll get over 60 votes, but I'm not so certain, taking a look at the past and looking at what happened with the reconciliation bill last year. But again, Senator Simon, in his closing remarks, and he's not here, I shouldn't refer to him too often since he isn't here, but you can check the record, and in his closing remarks, he said that every generation has paid its own way. I beg to differ. Perhaps the one reason why I really oppose the Simon Amendment. Again, I return to the personal. In the Great Depression, from 1934 to 1939, under the Roosevelt administration, under the direction of Harry Hopkins, we spent over $9 billion on relief in this country. Did it stop the Depression? Not really. It never really got us out of the Depression. But what it did is it saved a lot of lives. It kept people from starving to death. It kept people from freezing in the wintertime, and I ought to know. When my father lost that farm in 1929 and couldn't find work, he had to go on WPA later on in the 30s. And had it not been for WPA, I don't know what would have happened to my family. That generation didn't pay its way, but thank God we had a government that cared. And we had a government that knew that by investing in people during that period of time, we would build a stronger country and future generations would be secure. So I beg to differ. Each generation has not paid its own way. And sometimes when we have a recession, we are going to have to make sure that this country responds by taking care that people don't fall through the bottom and that they don't starve and they don't freeze to death. And so that's not taken care of in the Simon Amendment. Again, you'd have to have a supermajority to pass that, and I'm not certain that that would be there. So, in essence, I believe the Simon Amendment was seriously flawed. Again, my vote should not be interpreted that I will not vote in the future for a balanced budget amendment. In the past, I have supported some and I have opposed some. And again, I would point out that Mr. Simon changed his amendment at least twice since 1986, so it's not written in stone. Well, others say this issue will come back. Well, perhaps it will. I will look again at how it's written. But it must provide, I think, number one, to keep Social Security out. Number two, it must provide for a majority vote, not this supermajority, but a majority vote to take care in times of recession when we might need to spend money in order to keep people alive. And I would just close on that note. I believe, quite frankly, after reading the Constitution and looking at the rules of the Senate, I really believe, and I see the distinguished President Pro Tem here who knows it much better than I do in the whip, I really believe that the filibuster rules are unconstitutional. I believe the Constitution sets out 5 times when you need majority or supermajority votes in the Senate for treaties and impeachment. We all know the 5. I believe by having a filibuster rule, I believe that provides for a minority to determine the course and the outcome of legislation and to decide whether something is enacted in